HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents Broken: How Our Social Systems Are Failing Us and How We Can Fix Them, by Paul Leblanc. Read by Adam Barr. Introduction. I have worked in higher education for all of my adult life, but this book is not about higher education, nor is it a memoir. It's about how we can put people back at the center of systems that ostensibly exist to serve them, but so often fail them instead, often miserably so. That realization arose for me when I was writing Students First: Equity, Access, and Opportunity in Higher Education, a book about how to fix our system of higher education, the system I know best. That book, published in 2021, covers system redesign, better ways to measure performance, alternative ways to structure financial aid, and other attributes that shape our system of higher education. If we are to fix that system, we have to look hard at the way it is structured, at the policies, technologies, organizational structures, and operating assumptions that constitute the whole. The goal of that analysis seems obvious: to make the system work better for students. Yes, higher education exists for many reasons: to create new knowledge, serve the economy, prepare the workforce, and provide entertainment. But its raison d'etre is educating learners so they can improve their lives, nurture their families, and serve their communities. As such, the system should reflect a devotion to, dare I say, love for, students. However, for too many Americans, the system inflicts a kind of emotional, psychological, and even material violence. Consider a system that fails 45% of those who enter but never complete a degree, saddles students with $1.7 trillion of debt, more than any form of debt aside from home mortgages, creates anxiety and even depression among high school students worried about the admissions process, forces students to conform to the system's demands rather than build in system flexibility to meet individual student needs, exploits student-athletes to serve a multi-billion-dollar entertainment business in which they share almost none of the wealth they create, while their football coach routinely is the highest-paid person on campus, and favors those who already enjoy prosperity and privilege while perpetuating inequities and failing low-income students, especially students of color. Does this sound like a system that loves its students, the people it is supposed to serve? Ironically, higher education is full of people who care deeply about students and who come to their work with a sense of calling. Yet it routinely fails its students, is viewed with diminished regard by Americans, and is frequently seen as a problem for our society, not part of the solution. That same argument can be made for other systems in our society, systems ostensibly designed to serve people in critically important ways, but routinely fall short. I have many friends working in healthcare who were drawn to their profession by a desire to help, heal, and even save people, but who now serve a system that fails Americans in myriad ways. Millions of Americans do not have easy and affordable access to high-quality health care. We pay more for our prescription drugs than any other country, and low-income citizens often make trade-offs between food, rent, and the medicine they need to survive. Our bankruptcy courts are filled with cases of uninsured people sunk by medical bills. Parts of our country have infant and maternal mortality rates more typical of underdeveloped economies. I also know of many people who work in the criminal justice system, from police officers to judges, who came to their careers with a sense of calling, but are now part of a system that imprisons and executes more people as a percentage of the population than any other economically developed country. That includes the failed war on drugs effort, resulting in mass incarceration of people of color and the devastation of black communities. That embraces a militarized and armed response to basic human problems of mental health and addiction and poverty, and that perpetuates structural racism. Our government is full of people who take quite seriously their role of public servant and see their work as a kind of civic duty. During a sabbatical, I worked in the U.S. Department of Education and met scores of people who cared deeply about their responsibility to the American public good. Yet we have a democracy that is teetering for a variety of reasons, and the public worries about the government's ability to do good work, its enormous waste and inefficiency, and the corrosive influence of deep-pocketed special interests. How often do people positively describe their interactions with the bureaucracies of higher education, healthcare, the criminal justice system, or government? Conversely, people who started working in those systems with a genuine desire to improve lives now feel besieged, unsupported, and demoralized. For far too many people who work in or are served by these systems, a kind of dehumanization has set in, and not always for lack of investment either. The U.S. spends enormous sums on these systems, $3.8 trillion on healthcare, $182 billion on prisons, and $632 billion on higher education, and yet they routinely fail us. When we seek to improve these systems, our efforts focus on policy debates, technical solutions, funding, and data. While these are important, this book explores what is required to put core human questions back at the heart of our distinctly human-serving systems, what I call systems of care. I originally set out to answer the question of what it would take for my industry, higher education, to love its students again. But my inquiry expanded to ask that question of all systems of care, not in a customer service sense, though that would help too. I became increasingly focused on more existential questions, prompting me to explore topics like mattering, aspiring, storytelling, and yes, even loving. My reflections on those topics borrow heavily from my experience in higher education, the system I know best, and from my life. For those lessons to have context, and so I won't have to provide background each time it comes up, I will share a little about my journey. However, I include throughout the book stories and insights from colleagues in other industries and systems, because the questions are as central to those other areas as they are to my industry. Indeed, they are the most important questions we can ask as we try to fix a broken America that is failing far too many of its people. A note about the text. While published sources are cited, my recorded conversations with the many amazing people I interviewed during the course of my research are not. The excerpts from those recorded interviews are simply presented as conversation, with no associated citation. My story. The professional journey. I fell in love with teaching when I was a teaching assistant in the English department at Boston College, where I studied for my master's degree. It was an 11th-hour appointment, just days before the start of the fall semester, and provided free tuition and a modest stipend. It felt like winning the lottery. I was handed a pile of books to teach and assigned a couple of sections of freshman composition, the mandatory first-year writing class for all incoming students. 10 minutes before the very first class I was to teach, I broke the zipper on my pants. I rushed to the classroom and sat behind the desk for that whole first hour, no doubt worrying my students that I was not a very dynamic instructor. That inauspicious beginning notwithstanding, I discovered a love for teaching, took joy in my students, and had that exhilarating sense when one discovers what one is supposed to do in this life. I would be an educator. To do that and compete for a full-time academic job, I needed a doctorate. So I went from BC to the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, where I once again taught in the writing program. After completing my doctorate, I landed a faculty position at Springfield College as an assistant professor of English. I pretty quickly became department chair and grew active in campus governance and politics, serving as the faculty senate president during a contentious period when the college rid itself of a failed president. At the same time, I was working with a lot of the emerging technologies of the 1990s, writing about ways to harness those technologies in teaching, learning, and publishing. That work came to the attention of Houghton Mifflin Company, now Houghton Mifflin Harcourt, one of the large textbook publishers trying to make sense of new technologies for its industry. Houghton persuaded me to take a leave of absence from Springfield College, and from 1993 to 1996, I led a fledgling technology business for the company, getting something like a hands-on MBA in the process. As I prepared to return to Springfield College, I was nominated for the presidency of tiny Marlborough College, located in the hills of southern Vermont. Being only 37 years old, I was sure I had no shot at the job, but thought interviewing would be a good learning experience. I arrived for the interview in the late afternoon, and knowing that energies would be flagging for the search committee members by then, I brought warm cookies. The chair of the board, Lil Farber, later told me that while I was not yet their choice, the cookies ensured I'd make it to the next round. I was eventually offered the job, so in 1996, my wife Pat and I moved to that bucolic campus with Emma and Hannah, our 8- and 6-year-old daughters. I served there for 7 years, learned an enormous amount, and accomplished a lot. We revitalized a tired physical plant, raised tens of millions of dollars, elevated the college's profile, and located much-needed new sources of revenue. Despite all of that, I was never able to persuade the college community to grow or pursue new online programs that could have solved the structural limitations of Marlborough's size, which would eventually catch up with it and lead to its closure in 2020. Worse, I was never a really great cultural fit. For all that was going so well, I was ready to leave in 2003, and I think most of the campus community was ready to say goodbye to me. So, in 2003, I arrived at Southern New Hampshire University, SNHU. At the time, it had about 2,500 students, mostly in its residential campus program, and a $50 million budget, little endowment or reserves, a worn-out campus, and scant brand awareness. But its mission was focused on students, and it had a hunger to grow and improve, some history of innovation, and a small online program. My gracious predecessor, Dick Gustafson, had brought the place back from the brink of closure during his 16 years there, started the online program, and stabilized the finances. In a story that has been told in many other places, we embraced online learning and transformed SNHU into the country's largest university, serving 180,000 learners at the time of this writing. Along the way, we rebuilt the outdated campus, hired thousands of people across the country, innovated around new program design and technology, surpassed the $1 billion mark, and made SNHU one of the best-known universities in the country. With a relentless focus on underserved learners, we have more people of color enrolled with us than do the largest historically black colleges and universities. We bring full degree programs to refugees in places like Lebanon, Kenya, and South Africa. And we serve homeless kids and Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, DACA, students. We use our resources to feed low-income kids in our home city of Manchester, created the Center for New Americans, invest in Black-owned and managed equity funds, support military families, and more. We also treat our people well, being the sole university named to the Chronicle of Higher Education's Great Colleges to Work For list every year since its inception. No longer that wet-behind-the-ears new president who arrived in southern Vermont, I have been honored to serve in a variety of leadership roles in American higher education. I have chaired the American Council on Education Board and the Association of Governing Boards Council of Presidents. I have served on the National Academies Board on Higher Education and Workforce, as well as the boards of the Council of Independent Colleges, the Council for Adult and Experiential Learning, the Visiting Committee for Harvard's Graduate School of Education, and our Regional Commission on Higher Education. U.S. Senator Patty Murray of Washington nominated me to the National Advisory Committee on Institutional Quality and Integrity, the quasi-government committee that advises the U.S. Secretary of Education on matters of accreditation, sort of the accreditor of the accreditors. In 2018, I received the Teachers Insurance and Annuity Association's Theodore M. Hesburgh Award for Leadership Excellence, named for the legendary president of the University of Notre Dame. Previous winners include Britt Kerwin, Freeman Hrabowski, and Gail Mello, presidents I place on a pedestal. To be included in their number was incredibly moving, an honor I was not sure I deserved. A first-generation college graduate, a working-class kid without a blue-chip pedigree, I stood in front of the ballroom with a healthy sense of imposter syndrome, wishing my parents were still alive to be there. The professional journey I've just outlined will provide what is needed to follow the stories I share in the chapters that follow. For my personal journey, I offer this next account. My story, the personal journey. My family immigrated to the Boston area from Gaytons, a hardscrabble Acadian farming community in New Brunswick, Canada. It was a place where the men went away to find work, sometimes for weeks and often months, leaving their wives behind to tend to small farms, take care of the children, and get by in a place that was late getting paved roads, indoor plumbing, and adequate medical care. The poorest part of Canada, Gaytons was what some called French Appalachia. My parents had 8th grade educations, 5 kids to feed, and not nearly enough money. So they sold what little they had and joined relatives who had immigrated to the Boston area for work and better lives. That meant living with those relatives at first, and then in a rented apartment in a multi-unit building in Waltham's poorest neighborhood, where Irish and Italians had lived before us, and Puerto Ricans and Dominicans had followed. My mother got a job in a factory, my father as a laborer, and we started our version of the American dream. By the time I reached 1st grade, I could read well, but my spoken English still sounded funny, and the other kids would make fun of me. My teacher, Mrs. McKenna, would routinely ask me to read aloud in front of the class, which was so humiliating that I once avoided going to school by hiding behind the service station dumpster next door to my apartment. It was a deeply flawed plan. I had a 6-year-old sense of time. Within 20 minutes, I got bored and ate my lunch. In another 30 minutes or so, I showed up at my door, thinking that the day had surely passed by then. My mother, surprised, asked why I was home after only an hour, what had happened to my lunch, and how my clothes had gotten so dirty. Subsequent variations on my strategy to avoid reading in front of the class worked no better, and when I finally divulged why I didn't want to go to school, my mother met with the school principal, the wonderfully named Mr. Sentence, who spoke to me, then to Mrs. McKenna. I was never again subjected to the embarrassment of reading aloud in class, and Mrs. McKenna never warmed up to me after that incident. I had no interest in the odd version of French spoken by my Acadian family. An immigrant kid's desire to shed his language and fit in is familiar to any non-native child. Also common to many immigrant children is the lack of interest in one's cultural roots, which often feel more like a burden until after childhood, when one starts thinking about self-identity. At that point, a culture so long ignored and even resisted becomes a source of differentiation, identity, and insight. Before then, in an effort to escape that reality, one's history is at risk of being self-erased as well. It would be years before I would start to reclaim that knowledge. It started for me when my wife, Pat, and I were dating, and I took her to Gaytons to see where I was from and meet family. We sat in kitchens warmed by wood ovens still used for cooking, and this was 1978. Found my father's rough wood desk from his childhood in an uncle's attic, and visited the old farmhouse my family had sold when we left Canada. My cousin, one of 13 children, recalled being so poor that when my Aunt Celia had to go into town in winter to buy supplies, one of the older kids would have to stay home from school so Celia could use her boots. If New Brunswick is Canada's poorest province, Acadians were its least educated, poorest, and most rural citizens. Going back to it as a college student, I could see the poverty in ways I hadn't recognized in visits as a child, when outhouses and horse-pulled hay wagons seemed more exotic than a reflection of deprivation. Pat asked lots of questions, and I could not answer many of them. The act of bringing in someone from the outside, struggling to explain my own culture, is a little painful. What I realized was how little I actually understood it. I was like a goldfish who no longer noticed it was in water until someone asked about it. During that visit, Pat and I sat on a blanket on the earthen rampart of nearby Fort Beausejour, the French fort that protected Acadia from the British and succumbed to Boston-based American provincial troops in 1755, reading a history I did not know, my cultural history. History's losers rarely recover. Generational poverty has persisted among Acadians who would never catch up with English-speaking Protestants. The Acadians had fallen too far behind in terms of land, wealth accumulation, access to credit, and education. While visiting relatives there, even in the 1960s, I remember using a chamber pot on nights that were too cold to visit the outhouse, and using an outside pump when fetching water for my aunt. My mother recalled a childhood memory of following a priest eating an orange, and eagerly picking up the rinds he carelessly tossed aside so she could suck on the pith. Protestants went to provincial schools, while my family members went to those run by the Catholic Church. The Church led the cultural renaissance of Acadians, ran schools and charities, and was a source of comfort for many. But my family also tells of domineering and often imperious village priests who dictated much of day-to-day life. There is a delicious irony in our older daughter, Emma, moving in 2014 to Kedgwick, New Brunswick, an Acadian community of impoverished forest workers living on the fringes of capitalism and finding ways to subvert and resist another colonizer, this time Irving Oil instead of the British. Emma was visiting my sister in New Brunswick while home from Oxford, where she was studying anthropology with a special interest in communities that create their own informal systems of law, commerce, and being. Originally planning to do her research in Syria with nomadic tribes, she was ordered out by Syrian officials during the growing civil war. In New Brunswick, she stumbled upon another such community, Acadians in the remote northern forests. Emma spent almost 2 years there doing field work as she completed her doctorate. I eventually sent her dissertation to my siblings, and they were fascinated. Like the goldfish, they and I were in many ways understanding our culture for the first time. What we saw in her dissertation was our culture at its best and worst. I recognized my extended family on every page. The love of being in the woods, of hunting and fishing, of music and alcohol and raucous parties late into the night, of trucks and machines, of work that breaks a body, of spending all you have today and sharing with others. There is also the coarseness, the lack of education, the disorderliness of lives spent on the economic margins. Early, while getting reacquainted with Acadian culture, I found myself in central Louisiana doing consulting work at LSU of Alexandria. That Saturday, I rented a car and drove into Cajun country. I had a beer at Fred's Lounge in Mamou, self-billed as the Cajun music capital of the world, listened to Zydeco, and was surrounded by Bouchers, Boudreaux, and Leblancs, and they all looked like my relatives. That evening, over dinner with friends in Alexandria, I was waxing on about these long-lost cousins, when my friend Stacy only half joked, "Well, y'all know that around here, Cajuns are sort of known for skirting the law, sleeping around, and drinking too much and driving off bridges." Even though I had reveled in the warmth of the companionship, the infectious music, and the sense of familial familiarity among my Cajun cousins, I also recognized the fallen-down buildings, the junk in the yards, and the rough-looking men and women clustered around pickup tailgates with beers and cigarettes. It all felt like home, good and bad. Acadians are underdogs, so they immediately feel great kinship with other downtrodden people. From Emma's dissertation. Acadians are seen as the losers of history and capitalism, and insider values are construed fundamentally as subaltern values. People regularly draw explicit connections between local Kedgwick insiders and other peoples perceived to belong to the same moral community through their shared subalternity. Acadianité, or Acadianness, may be most clearly demonstrated by speaking French and having the right name and ancestry. Kepi, 2013, page 318. But Acadian is also a relative status. Acadians are defined as the downtrodden, and the insider sphere is often extended to anyone in an Acadian position, from Syrian refugees to Amazonian tribes exploited by multinational companies, or even deer, birds, and fish whose habitat is threatened. On Facebook, for example, people in Kedgwick post links to articles about indigenous struggles over natural resources in Latin America and Papua New Guinea, emphasizing the similarity of their values and their exploitation. When people from Kedgwick go on vacation in Cuba, they often befriend the staff at the hotels where they stay and end up incorporating them into their networks of resource sharing, sending them money, clothes, shoes, towels, and school supplies once they return to Canada. When people in Kedgwick found out that New Brunswick was going to accept Syrian refugees, they began collecting goods for them, from winter clothes to canned food. One local woman even insisted that she wanted to donate her car. The downtrodden are seen as fellow moral insiders, both because their enemies, the corporations, governments, and militaries responsible for their oppression, are seen as prototypical outsiders, greedy, self-interested, and obsessed with profit, and because the Kedgwickois recognized the link between insider moral principles and poverty and political marginalization. My father liked to watch the news and follow politics, and he always rooted for the underdog. He was the only person I knew who wanted the Argentinians to prevail in the Falklands War. His long-standing antipathy to the British no doubt contributed to that sentiment. My mother rushed to help anyone in need, welcomed people of all races and backgrounds into her kitchen, and had a rare ability to forgive almost any wrong. There are many stories of my parents' generosity. For example, in the gossipy ways of small farming villages, a local woman who was marginally better off than my mother frequently badmouthed her. Yet when her panicked husband knocked on the door at 2 a.m., asking for help because she was having a difficult delivery, my mother bundled up and assisted in the birth. When the woman woke up the next morning, it was my mother who was rocking the swaddled newborn while keeping a watchful eye on the woman. I used to think it was because she was Catholic and had some innate understanding of redemption or forgiveness, but I think it was because she was Acadian, or perhaps both. My parents' ethos also included tolerance. On a Christmas Eve, my family had stopped at the local general store to buy something, and my father gave his last dollar to someone out front, panhandling, a guy in the village who everyone knew had a drinking problem. When my mother mentioned that he would probably just spend the money on drink, my father's reply was, "If that's the best Christmas he can have, I'm glad I can help." Similarly, I had a cousin who routinely got into trouble with the law. People would hide their wallets when he was in their house, and he was the subject of constant criticism for being a bad kid. But my parents welcomed him in, fed him, and reminded people of the rough childhood he had suffered. When a judge eventually gave him a choice between prison and Vietnam, his letters home from those faraway jungles were to my parents. An extension of that underdog mentality and the there but for the grace of God go I sympathy that runs through Acadian culture and my family's is an assessment of people on their basic human traits: kindness, generosity, parenting style, loyalty, and work ethic. To be lazy in my family was just about the worst thing possible.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?